Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love. Written by isthisselfcare. Narrated by S.E.P. Author chapter notes, in which Draco continues to be a terribly unreliable narrator, featuring more of my favorite fanfic moments. Please mind the slow burn tag. This is the Hermione story I wanted to read, and UST is my kink. Emphasis on the U. Expect false starts, hesitation, all manner of idiocy, and an eventual denunciation in the endgame. This fic is not for the short or medium-term gratification seekers, but rather the masochists who like to suffer. If that is you, then please read on and let us suffer together. Chapter 17. The Dinner. Draco Malfoy almost causes the next murder sensation. To Draco's devious pleasure, McLaggen took him up on the invitation to pop by the next pitch a few weeks later. An unfortunate sequence of events occurred, which had positively absolutely nothing to do with Draco, wet conditions, terribly aggressive bludgers, temperamental brooms, that resulted in McLaggen taking a tumble off his broom from 30 meters up. "I say," said Davies, watching McLaggen being carted off the pitch by Mediwitches, "that bludger had it in for the bloke." "I didn't even hit it that hard," said Sabini. "Poor old egg," said Draco. "First time back on the broom in a while, as I understand it." "Perhaps bludgers can smell fear," suggested Sabini. "Hope it doesn't put him off the sport," said Davies. "We need a decent keeper. Bickford's moving to Spain." The general mood was a little subdued after the accident. The players decided to call it quits for the night, said their goodbyes, disapparated off to shower. All except for Draco, who found to the contrary that the accident had had a stimulating effect on his morale. He left the pitch feeling quite invigorated. Granger had a grievance to air. This development was heralded by her silvery otter, which found Draco the next evening. The timing was hideous. Draco was on a sensitive stakeout in Foulmere, about to apprehend the notorious Thomas Talfrin. "You! You promised you wouldn't do anything!" shrieked Granger's otter into Draco's face. "You are the worst!" The shrill sound of Granger's voice echoed through the alley where Draco had been hidden. Talfrin, who had been smoking in the doorway, just out of a stunning range, started, and disapparated. "Fucking fuck!" hissed Draco. The otter, having conveyed his message, disappeared. With a snarl, Draco pulled out Granger's schedule. She was home, which was perfect, because he was going to murder her. He apparated to her cottage in an extremely foul mood. He swept her wards aside and stormed up the path to her front door, which he proceeded to hammer. Granger flung open the door with a vehemence that suggested that she, too, was on a warpath. "You're a bloody idiot," said Draco by way of a greeting. "Me?" said Granger. She was wild about the eyes. "Me? You're the idiot. You weren't to touch McLaggen. You just ruined my best chance to catch a bloody Talfrin with your stupid otter. You sent McLaggen to A&E. "I've been pursuing Talfrin for 3 fucking months, snarled Draco. "Guess who was on shift at A&E last night?" screeched Granger. "Talfrin has charges against him longer than my arm. Beast baiting, forgery, blood sports, racketeering, cruelty to magical creatures, extortion. I had to take care of that troglodyte for 4 fucking hours. You broke all of his limbs. Fraud, assault, smuggling, and you utterly botched it. Now he's gone again." "McLaggen lived for every bloody hot nurse fantasy last night, thanks to you," said Granger, jabbing her finger in Draco's chest. Draco snatched her hand and pulled it down. "If you could keep your fucking emotions under control, I'd have my man in shackles, but no, you had to send your rabid otter." "My emotions?" blamed Granger. "You're the one who worked himself up into a lather over McLaggen. You're the one who had spectacularly bollocksed my stakeout with your shrieking. If you had kept your word, none of this would have happened. I didn't even do anything. The man fell off his broom like the hollow-headed cretin he is. I don't believe you for an instant. Believe whatever you want." "I will. You're an opportunistic ghoul. You're a quarrelsome bloody shrew. I can't stand you. I can't stand you." Then they stood, tempers blazing, lips apart, breaths coming quickly, and waited for the other to spit out a retort, so they might continue tearing each other's heads off. Somehow, in the process of their screaming match and finger-jabbing, they had come to stand very close together. Granger was on the doorstep, so that, for once, her height almost matched Draco's. He felt her breath flutter against his chin. Her anger made her glow. Her gaze was afire in the heat of her conviction. Her cheeks were flushed. She wanted to throttle him as much as he wanted to throttle her. And there was a moment of madness, where the fulcrum between rage and passion wavered and tilted. And he could have throttled her. or he could have crushed his mouth against hers, hard, to do something with the intensity of the feeling, to shut her up, to prove a point. The mad possibility was contagious. Her eyes flitted to his mouth, then she blinked, and like a thing awakening from a trance, looked distantly shocked. Realizing that he was still gripping at her hand, Draco released it and took a large step back. Granger, too, took a large step away, and looked like she'd rather toddle back to the crypt and throw herself onto the crucio carpet than be there. Her blush carried her from her cheeks across the bridge of her nose. Draco, feeling utterly thrown off kilter by the moment, cleared his throat, cast about for a thing to say, nothing was forthcoming, and then he said he'd best be off, as it was getting dark. Granger looked anywhere but at him and said, "Right." Mutually satisfied with this mature, robust conclusion to their quarrel, they stepped apart even further, and Granger made as though to shut the door. There was a long, sustained meow from somewhere in the garden. In the shadows, an orangey blotch advanced towards them. The cat paused at Draco's feet, and then, as it was bestowing a great gift upon him, it wound itself around his boots and coated his trousers in orange. Draco was almost as wrong-footed by this as by the moment with Granger. He hardly knew what to do with himself. However, when he bent down to stroke the cat, it hissed at him and fled back into the dark garden. "It's on his terms, and his terms only," said Granger. "Pernickety creature." "He is." Granger studied a bit of peeling paint on the doorpost. Draco stared at the wisteria. Granger bit her lip. "Did I really ruin your stakeout?" "Yes." "Did McLagan really end up with you last night?" "Yes." They muttered something that may have been, to the listener with impossibly acute ears, an apology, in a language principally consisting of mutters and throat-clearing. Their seething fury gave way now to a certain degree of abashedness, which Draco was more adept at hiding than Granger. "Did he really have all of his limbs broken?" asked Draco. "All, and a concussion to boot." "Ah, poor boy." "Blood sports, though?" asked Granger, with a bit of do-goodery anxiety creeping into her voice. "Nandu baiting," nodded Draco. "Talfrin's made a bloody fortune on it, too." "Nandu? How is he even keeping one captive?" "We aren't sure. A tranquilizer cocktail, no doubt. Stunners." "Shit," said Granger, looking freshly guilty. "Indeed." The conversation petered out. The wisteria's long fronds fluttered to the breeze, so Draco looked at them again, out of pure intellectual curiosity. Granger took a powerful interest in a crack on the threshold. Draco was about to say that he had to be off, again, but Granger's stance shifted. She was no longer positioned to pounce at his throat. She was half turned into the house, hesitating over something. Normally Draco would have prompted her, rudely, but today he rather felt that he had used up his rudeness allowance. Granger cleared her throat and spoke in a smallish voice. "I had something I wanted to show you." "What is it?" Granger disappeared into the cottage and returned with a newspaper clipping. She passed it to Draco. It was from the 7th page of the Prophet, entitled "Plundering in Provence." The article described the theft of a relic from a monastery that Draco had certainly never heard of in his life. The burglars were described as uniquely powerful individuals with a penchant for arson, who had defeated nigh impenetrable security measures unbroken since 1008. Our readers will be as flabbergasted as the investigators when they learn that the prized relic, the skull of a saint, was returned to the monastery anonymously a few days after the break-in. Investigators expect that the burglars may have been thrill-seekers looking for a challenge. A few of the sisters sustained non-life-threatening injuries following the intrusion. When asked whether the investigation would continue, French authorities said, "What a question, idiot. The relic is returned, no?" Which our correspondent takes to mean, no. "I got my alliterative headline," said Draco. "You did?" Granger twisted her hands together. "I got what I absolutely didn't want, which was publicity." "You will be the prime suspect, certainly," said Draco. "Everyone knows that beloved healer Hermione Granger is secretly a thrill-seeker and an arsonist." Granger gave him a provoking look. "Be serious." "I am." "You're a perilous sort of witch." Granger plucked the article out of Draco's hands, pulled out her wand, and burnt the clipping. "See? More arson," said Draco. "And we can add destroying evidence to your list of crimes. You'll have to arrest me if I continue down this troubled path. I'm already thinking of it. Did the skull end up being useful? Please tell me it was worth the faff." "It was," said Granger, "immensely. I've made significant strides." "Good." Granger leaned against the doorpost, a small amount of awkward tension gone. "My next frolic will be devastatingly boring in comparison. I'll believe that when I see it. It's true, I'm only going to Hogwarts. Whatever for? A medieval text, One of Snape's. Ah, said Draco. Snape had bequeathed the entirety of his library to Hogwarts, and had thus, in one fell swoop, made the school's rare book collection almost as extensive as that of the most universities. That won't be till later in the summer, at Lunasa. Not because any magical potencies are at play, mind you. It's just my next weekend off, before a shrill sound erupted her. Draco's first thought was a ward alarm. He whipped around, brandishing his wand, with every intention to maim. Granger gasped. I left the cooker on! Draco had smelled something burning, come to think of it, but he thought it was a bit of newspaper. Granger plunged into the house. Draco followed to witness whatever entertainment was to come. She pulled something out of the cooker, something quite black. Draco opened a window and conjured a stiff breeze to air the place out. Well, said Granger, looking sad, that was dinner. Said Draco, observing the coal. Draco had naively thought that her font of fury had been drained. He was wrong. Granger always had an additional supply of wrath. This is your fault, said Granger, turning towards him with a hand on her hip. You distracted me. What was it? Said Draco, to ascertain whether he should feel bad. Granger pointed to the bin. A box was sticking out of it, which indicated that it had been Miss Mabel's frozen fish pie. I haven't the slightest regret, said Draco. Granger scraped the blackened heap into the bin, along with the box, which was, in Draco's opinion, where it had belonged in the first place. Now Granger was poking about the cupboards, the contents of which were 2 bins of tuna, dried beans, a packet of biscuits. Take away it is. I usually pop around to the shops at the weekend. Stop looking so judgy. Draco, feeling very judgy indeed, about the dried beans, was struck by an impetuous, mad, wild idea. Granger. What? Come with me to dinner. Granger, who had disappeared halfway to Narnia to retrieve a stale box of crackers, pulled out of her cupboard. What? Granger repeated himself, slowly, with interpretive gestures so that she would understand. You, me, dinner. He might as well have suggested setting fire to a children's hospital for all the shock his suggestion generated. You want to eat dinner with me. Tonight? On purpose? No, said Draco with a thick layer of sarcasm slathering across the top. By accident. We'll trip up to the table with our mouths open and mash in some hors d'oeuvres. Granger was still looking at him askance. Draco raised his eye to the ceiling. She was making such a thing of this. I promised that if I were going to poison you, it would have been upon my arrival, not now. There's a rather large amount of food waiting for me at the manor, and it would be a delight to the elves. And, he hastened to add, my mother is in Florence. She was still regarding him in suspicion, kind of confusion, her arms crossed in the typical Granger defense stance. Why, it's my fault you burnt your cardboard pie. Granger's raised eyebrow suggested that it was a lot of things were his fault, for which he'd never attempt to make amends previously, so why would he have to pardon her misgivings? Shall we go? Asked Draco, ignoring these rather just qualms. Granger stood unmoving, studying him skeptically, as though she was trying to work out his ulterior motive. It was a stark and aggravating contrast to the typical witch's reaction to a dinner invitation from Draco Malfoy, which was usually breathless yeses and a great many giggles. Not that he was inviting her to that kind of dinner. He was simply observing the distinction. The smell of burnt fish pie wafted from the bin and settled around them in a gentle, tragic aura. It spurred Granger to action. She crammed the bin's lid on tightly, turned, and made for the stairs. Women didn't run from Draco, as a general rule. Quite the contrary. It was an unfamiliar and unpleasant sensation. Oi! Said Draco, vexed. I'm going to change, called Granger. I am not going to the manor in my house things. Besides, I stink of burnt. Draco, as he watched her and her bum sprint up the stairs in her short muggle shorts, vaguely wanted to say that he didn't object to the house things, and that it was only her and him at dinner, so it didn't matter. And plus, she often smelled a bit like candle smoke, and that didn't bother him in the least. However, Granger was upstairs, so Draco kept these mawkish sentiments to himself. He waited for her to change, which took approximately 2 business days. Then she came tumbling down the stairs, wearing a red summer dress. There, now we'll be presentable. Presentable for whom? I don't know, said Granger, pulling her hair into a low side bun that was somehow both elegant and messy. Being with you attracts chaos. I half expect Shacklebolt to decide to pop in for a chit-chat. Draco felt that the chaos attractor was her, but nevertheless. I rather hope he does. He can tell Tonks I'm building a rapport with my principal and not being a frightful bully. You aren't a bully. You're just pushy, said Granger, sliding on strappy heels. I'm pushy? Bit bossy, really. Oh, this is rich. They apparated to the miter, and from there flew to the Swan, and from there apparated to the Manor. It was the same trajectory that they had taken on that fateful night when Granger had popped into existence on the Manor's Quidditch pitch, only in reverse, and in less frantic circumstances. This thought also seemed to have crossed Granger's mind as they materialized at the Manor. Just as Draco was stealing a glance at her, Granger met his eyes. Then she held up her hand. It was only trembling slightly. "Progress," said Granger. Draco said, "Well done," with quiet sincerity. The Manor's large front doors swung open at their approach. One of the younger house elves scurried across the entrance hall with a high-pitched word of welcome, and then he saw Granger. He squeaked in surprise, disapparated, and then his voice echoed from the kitchens. "Master is home, and he brought a lady! Make whipped cream!" Then the elf apparated before them again, as though he hadn't gone anywhere in the first place. "Welcome, sir and miss." "Thank you, Tuppy. Could you tell the kitchens that I will be joined by my colleague, Healer Granger, for dinner?" Draco might have well as broken the house elf's heart with his clarification. "Of course, sir," he said, his large eyes filled with sudden devastation. "And we want to dine on the south chairs," said Draco. Tuppy bowed and disapparated. Instantly, his shrill voice echoed with a request to cancel the whipped cream. Granger looked bemused. "Whipped cream?" "Never mind that," said Draco. "Let's have an aperitif to start. I think we've launched a panic in the kitchens." Granger was not quite so fixated on her feet as she'd been during her last visit. She glanced about, taking in the white walls, the enchanted clusters of candles floating every few paces, the fires ablaze in the many hearths. The new manor was a sight less dreary than the old one. Draco steered her toward one of the salons, which was well supplied with all manner of snacks. Narrator side note, I am changing the pronunciation of the elf's name because I think it's Toopy, not Tuppy. They had 20 seconds to select a seat and pick at olives before Toopy materialized again, desiring to know what they'd like to drink. "A cognac for me," said Draco. "And for Healer Granger?" asked Toopy. "Red wine, please." "Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Malbec?" asked Toopy. Granger appeared paralyzed by the onslaught of choices. I'll try the Malbec, thank you." Toopy bowed and disapparated. Next came Henriette, who was slightly better at concealing her excitement. Only her quivering ears gave her away. "Mademoiselle Granger," she said with a curtsy before proffering her a tray. "Roulas of zucchini, spicy nuts with a piri-piri, blinis of salmon, and goat with pesto." The tray was set to hovering next to Granger. Henriette disapparated. Granger opened her mouth to say something, but there was another crack, and Toopy apparated with the drinks. Draco was given his with the usual amount of politeness, but Granger's was placed in her hand with the utmost care. Toopy disapparated. Draco opened his mouth to speak, but a third elf apparated from the kitchens to ask whether colleague Healer Granger had any allergies or preferences the kitchen should be aware of. She did not. The kitchen elf disapparated. Granger attempted a comment, but Henriette cracked into existence with serviettes and tiny forks, and disapparated again. Granger and Draco eyed each other warily as silence descended upon the salon, half expecting another loud crack to interrupt their attempt at conversation. "They are a bit intense, aren't they?" said Granger. "They are positively itching for guests," said Draco. "When my mother is away, there aren't any functions to host, and there's only me to feed." "This entire tray is enough for dinner," said Granger, selecting a salmon blini. No, save your appetite." They meandered towards the south terrace. It was an exquisite summer night, warm and blessed with a sweet, playful little breeze. The breeze toyed with the escaped tendrils of Granger's hair and tugged at the hem of her dress. Not that Draco was looking at her. The grounds were illuminated at night by enchanted candles and lanterns at the foot of every tree, and strung along all of the footpaths. In some ways, the effect was even more magnificent than during the day. The fountains and water features shimmered, and the flowers were luminous, as though glowing from within. Draco left Granger to admire the prospect of the gardens, while he strode ahead to see if the table was ready. He was satisfied by what the house elves had put together on such short notice. A silver table and 2 chairs, a surfeit of summer flowers lending to their perfume to the night, and a real extravagance of lanterns and fairy lights. It was, however, terribly romantic. Henriette was laying it on rather thick, given that Draco had specified a colleague. He had had countless dinners and drinks with colleagues and collaborators al fresco over the summer, and Henriette had never once seen fit to decorate with roses. Red roses. "Henriette," he called. "Oui?" replied Henriette, cracking into existence at his side. "You are a scallywag." I do not know that word, said Henriette, shrugging her lack of comprehension. The roses, Henriette. What about them, monsieur? They are too much. Too much what, monsieur? Too much everything, Henriette. You have to be bewitched, monsieur. Which was just what Draco was asking for, really. Unsolicited mysticism about allowing himself to be bewitched. Take them away, Henriette. They are at the peak of their bloom, monsieur. It seems a pity to waste them. Nevertheless, I'd like— Oh, came Granger's voice. The roses! Henriette gave Draco a long look, which suggested that, as always, she knew best, and if he'd stop second-guessing her, he would also stop making a fool of himself, the silly boy. Granger was clutching her hands together, standing before the table. How beautiful! I've never seen this variety. Is it double-flowered? And the coloration, it's so deep. It is the Apolline, said Henriette. The rose garden is quite resplendent with them, mademoiselle. You should go for a walk after dinner. I am sure monsieur would be pleased to escort you, in Madame Malfoy's absence. The monsieur in question gave Henriette a quelling look in the face of this fresh impertinence. Granger, however, found a vast delight in the idea, and said that she would adore it, and asked where the Apolline had come from, and how long that they had had her. Food first, then feminine ecstasies about the rose garden, said Draco. Granger and Henriette both regarded him coolly and made Draco feel the weight of their low opinion of him. Henriette indicated that she would fetch their first course. Granger took her chair with a sniff. I wouldn't want my feminine ecstasies to get in the way of your masculine appetites, of course. Draco hid a smirk at his cognac. And what do you know about my masculine appetites? Only that they're unrelenting. Accurate. And impair your judgment. Sometimes. We can only hope that they will be satisfied by Henriette's entree. Then perhaps we can have a civil conversation about roses, uninterrupted. Partially satisfied, probably. Granger regarded him with narrowed eyes, as though she were detecting the double entendre, but wasn't quite sure he meant it. Draco decided to let her stew in the incertitude. Henriette and Tupi arrived with crab and herbed butter. They ate. Granger was dainty about it, as she tended to be, and easily distracted by long looks out past the terrace and onto the candlelit grounds. Now she had her chin propped onto the back of her hand and was gazing at the evanescent beauty of a row of poplars, whose young leaves shivered in the breeze like silver medallions. Draco half wanted to interrupt her and bring her back to the important things, himself, but it was also rather nice to sit in companionable silence and sip their drinks. Dinners at the manor were normally agenda-driven affairs, with either the guest or Draco having something to gain or something to lose. This one was unique for its lack of any of those pressures. Draco had no maneuvering to do and knew he wasn't being manipulated against. They were merely eating together, as he made small reparations for a burnt fish pie. Granger had no designs on his fortune or his person. Sometimes being with her was easy. Risotto un basilic? Said Henriette, sweeping away their crab and depositing a plump dollop of risotto in front of them instead. Basil wafted deliciously off of it. How do you know so much about roses, anyway? Asked Draco. My mom used to grow them, said Granger, with a kind of labored insouciance. Used to? She's quit the hobby? I don't know. I haven't seen my parents in a few years. Oh. Given that she was trying to look unaffected, Draco did not question her further on the subject, which he thought showed great delicacy. However, Granger continued. I obliviated both of them during the war, sent them to Australia to keep them safe. By the time I'd found them again, it was too late to reverse the spell without risking damage to their minds. They're living quite happily in Adelaide, and have no idea that they ever had a daughter. Ah yes, just what Draco had been hoping for, some light-hearted reminiscing about wartime tragedies. He didn't bother with words of sympathy because he didn't really do those, and she wouldn't believe he was being sincere anyway. This explains how careful you are with Obliviate, said Draco. Yes, it was a hard lesson to learn. Minds, memories aren't meant to be tampered with lightly, and I systematically dismantled 18 years' worth. That had repercussions. It kept your parents alive, said Draco. It did, at a cost. Granger finished her wine. Anyway, it's too beautiful an evening to be maudlin. Let's talk of other things. Draco finished his cognac so that her empty glass didn't feel lonely. He was sensitive that way. He eyed Granger. You rather look as though you have a subject in mind. Broken promises, said Granger. Accusation lingered in the statement. Draco raised an eyebrow, feeling rather targeted. I've broken a promise. Yes. Have I? Illuminate me. Just as Granger was about to speak, Tupi cracked into existence to suggest a Sauvignon Blanc for the next course. given that it was fish. Draco and Granger agreed to be served the wine and separated. "The archaeologist's report on the Celtic ruins," said Granger. "The ones you had found under the dungeons? You never sent it to me." Draco sat back in theatrical shock. "You're right! I never did. Caught in flagrante delictate." "Je suis," said Granger, looking grave. "A terrible breach of trust." "Will you ever forgive me?" "No. I quite fancy holding a fearsome grudge about it, perhaps launching a whole-scale feud." "You say that as though the House of Granger and Malfoy weren't already feuding," said Draco. "True," said Granger. As Granger mulled over this new complexity, Granger waved Henriette towards them and sent her to fetch the archaeologist's report. Henriette returned with a thick roll of parchment in her hand and a quizzical look on her face. She then offered to fetch other reading materials more suited to a summer evening, such as one book of French poesy. "No, thank you, Henriette. This will be all," said Draco. "Mademoiselle has particular literary taste and prefers to read about dead monks." Henriette disapparated with a shake of her head. Granger accepted the scroll with a smile playing across her lips. "Well, when you put it that way, I most certainly sound peculiar." Draco shrugged. "Peculiar is, at the very least, not boring." "I accept your poorly delivered backhanded excuse for a compliment," said Granger, unfurling the scroll. "I wouldn't want you to become conceited, you know." "No, you are unerringly vigilant on that front." Granger sank into the report, leaving her risotto to grow cold on her plate. She occasionally remembered Draco's presence, which she signaled by, "Oh!" and then a sharing of some fascinating snippet or other. Henriette apparated with the next course and gave Granger a reproving look when she took stock of the situation. "Mademoiselle, you have not eaten!" Granger jumped and blurted out an apology. She tucked the scroll away. She looked abashed as Henriette took away the risotto, now a congealed lump, and replaced it with the fish. Henriette deposited Granger's fish and artichokes with particular firmness, with imitations that if she did not consume it all, there would be words to be had. The effect of Henriette's menacing looming was somewhat lessened by the fact that her nose barely came above the table. However, Granger, wide-eyed, said the turbot looked utterly delicious, and crammed a few forkfuls into her mouth under Henriette's watchful eye. Satisfied, Henriette disapparated. Granger choked down her fish with the help of some wine. Draco was holding back his laughter. "You look properly terrorized." "She is frightening." Granger cast a furtive glance over her shoulder, and then looked back at him. "And I'm sorry, that was terribly rude of me. I got engrossed, and I didn't realize." "I should like to have a look about for a boggart," mused Draco between his own bites. "Perhaps in one of the spare rooms." Granger blinked. "A boggart? Whatever for?" "I have a feeling yours will now take the shape of an 80-year-old French house elf, and I'd like to confirm the theory." Granger bit at her lip to keep from smiling. "You think you're terribly funny." "I am," said Draco. "And what form would yours take, should we go boggart hunting?" Draco sat back and stapled his fingers together. "Now that's a question. I haven't encountered one since the war. I'd like to think it would no longer be Voldemort springing up at me like an enervated cadaver." "Well, what's frightened you recently?" "Would you like me to be honest with you?" "I'd prefer it, but I don't expect it," sniffed Granger. "There was a moment today, on your doorstep, when you looked like you were about to transfigure me into an insect and stamp on me." Granger looked as though she were making special note of this new idea. "What kind of insect?" "I don't know. I'd assume a loathsome little cockroach." "Nigh unkillable," said Granger, shaking her head. "Poor choice. I'd go with something more squishy. Though if I was to kill you, I'd like you to know that I wouldn't use transfiguration." "Oh, good. That wouldn't be sporting. How would you do it then?" "Perhaps tie you up and let Crookshanks have a go. Then I'd only be an accessory to murder." The first part of that sentence was promising, until you brought in the cat. Granger took no notice whatsoever of this mild flirtatious overture. She was reminiscing. "He nearly suffocated Ron once, laid down across his face as he was sleeping. I harbored a private fear that it was on purpose." "Well, that's settled then. My new boggart is your cat." Granger didn't give him the honor of an all-out laugh, but she hid a smile behind a sip of wine. Henriette returned to inspect Granger's progress. Granger said that it was all delicious, and that the artichokes in particular were the most perfectly prepared that she had ever had the pleasure of eating. Henriette said, "Parfait. They have a great many health benefits, you know. Artichokes." "Do they?" "Oui, oui. So many nutrients and vitamins. They are also an aphrodisiac." Henriette disapparated after conveying this vital information. Granger contemplated her empty plate with a kind of consternation. Draco nearly wanted to laugh. "I'll know what to blame should you get handsy," said Draco. Granger turned her gaze to his equally empty plate and said, "Likewise." Tupi and Henriette banished the empty plates and served dessert. "Millefeuille à la vanille de Bourbon," said Henriette, presenting the final course with a flourish. Tupi proposed a sweet Saturn's wine with accompaniment, which Draco and Granger accepted. Granger pressed her fork into the tender millefeuille. "Henriette, Tupi, I need to thank you. This meal was a great deal better than what I was going to have tonight." Henriette curtsied and Tupi bowed. "I am certain Miss Mabel makes a cracking fish pie," said Draco. "Pardon? Who is Miss Mabel?" asked Henriette. "Is it your house elf, mademoiselle?" "No," said Granger. She makes fish pies that you can buy at the shops. Well, I'm not actually sure she's a real entity. It's all marketing, probably." "Frozen fish pies," said Draco to Henriette. "Frozen pies that mademoiselle keeps frozen and then pops in the cooker when she has half a moment to think about feeding herself." Henriette gasped at this revelation. Tupi's hands flew to his mouth. "And when that fails, mademoiselle has 2 tins of tuna and some dried lentils. Those are the entire contents of her cupboards." Draco grew grave. "I've seen many troubling things in my life, Henriette, but mademoiselle's cupboards are another thing entirely." Henriette's hands were upon her heart. Her eyes were wide. "No!" "Oh, oui, I've seen it with my own eyes." "Monsieur is slightly exaggerating," said Granger, her grip on her fork suggesting that she might poke Draco with it, if he didn't stop scandalizing the elves. "You're right," said Draco. "There was also a box of crackers, only a few years old. Bit dusty, but still good." Henriette and Tupi both looked at Granger and seemed ready to weep. "I hadn't gone to the shops yet this week," said Granger in an attempt at reassurance. "That's why my cupboards were so empty. I was just busy." "Oh, yes," said Draco, "because they're usually filled to bursting, aren't they?" He'd been waiting for Granger's under-the-table kick, and it came. He snatched her ankle in his hand and tutted. Granger tried to regain possession of her foot, but Draco informed her that being kicky meant that she had lost foot privileges. Henriette was oblivious to the exchange, but busy being distraught about why nobody was helping mademoiselle in her empty cupboards. Tupi seemed on the verge of hyperventilation. "I have a modest proposal," said Draco. Granger's leg twitched. Draco's grasp held firm, and that was all it was, a grasp. Her ankle was bare and soft under his palm, and his fingers were curious about the delicate shape of her bones, what it would feel like to trace them, but he did not partake. It remained a grasp, because this was Granger, and he had no interest whatsoever in caressing her ankle. And if he had any interest in doing so, which he didn't, it would be the fault of the artichokes. Granger didn't quite seem to dare demand her foot back out loud in front of Henriette, because that would lead to uncomfortable questions about why she had attempted to kick Monsieur at the dinner table, which was a guffaw far greater than reading. "What proposal?" asked Granger in a kind of growl, as a cat caught by the scruff of its neck. "The house elves are bored out of their skulls without my mother and her fets. Why don't you give them permission to pop in once or twice a week and fill up your cupboards, at least until my mother is back?" "Absolutely not!" Draco gave Granger's ankle a squeeze before she could devastate the elves. Henriette and Tupi swiveled towards Granger as she spoke, hearts in their eyes at the thought of her empty pantry just waiting for attention. Henriette's hands were pressed against her breast. Tupi's were folded in a kind of supplication. Their swimmy eyes positively shimmered. Granger's voice died. "Absolutely necessary, I think mademoiselle was going to say," said Draco to the elves. Granger gave him a look, suggestive of a second incoming kick. If only she wasn't frightened of losing possession of her other foot, too. She gave the elves her best attempt at a smile. "Perhaps Monsieur and I could discuss the details in private." "So it's a yes, miss?" asked Tupi, breathless. "Of course it's a yes," said Henriette, starry-eyed. "Mademoiselle would never be so rude as to turn down Monsieur's offer. She is too bien élevée." Granger's smile was quite fixed. The elves bowed and curtsied half a dozen times, then disapparated to the kitchens to share the good news. "You would try the patience of a saint," said Granger through a clenched jaw. "Return my foot before I turn you into that cockroach." Draco relinquished possession of her foot, probably a bit slower than necessary, the tips of his fingers brushing at her ankle as he let go. She noticed. There was a flush of pink across her cheekbones, positively the wine, possibly other things. "I've only spoken to one saint, and she quite liked me," said Draco, running his hand through his hair. Granger blushed notwithstanding, was exasperated. "She'd only spent 5 minutes in your precious company, not long enough to discover how endlessly aggravating you are. like imposing house elves on me, of all people. What was the thought process, if any, behind that decision? I saw a problem that was in my capacity to fix, said Draco. It's a life philosophy I learned from a rather clever witch. Draco stared at him. The double blow of her own words and the genuine compliment threw her entirely off kilter. She sat back, struggling to remain cross. You are simply indescribable, I know, said Draco. Must you always have the last word? Only on the rare occasions when you permit it. Granger was struggling with her lingering annoyance and amusement. Her eyes sparkled with it. It made for a rather lovely picture. When does your mother come back to England? Not for another fortnight, said Draco. Then you'll be free of the elves. But in the meantime, you'll have given them back their joie de vivre. Granger was looking in the direction of the kitchens. Very well, but only because I don't want Henriette to think of me mal à la bête for rejecting your offer. I think she would take personal offense. If Henriette had concerns about your upbringing, she would have snubbed you from the beginning. She is a rather opinionated elf. Now eat your millefeuille, or she will be scolding you again. Granger turned her attention to her plate. Draco sipped at the sweet wine. What was the whipped cream for? Asked Granger. That is a private matter, and it would be best for you to forget it. Said Granger, studying him over her glass. They finished their desserts. Henriette materialized and kindly reminded Monsieur that he was meant to take Mademoiselle through the rose garden. Then she stood, her small hands curled into her bony hips, and stared intimidatingly at him until he got up and offered his arm to Granger. Granger's touch on his arm was light, at first, but after a few steps her grip tightened. Shit, is the ground a bit wobbly, or am I completely battered? We are both steeped to the tonsils in wine, said Draco. Tupi's attentions were unrelenting. It was a miracle neither of them had said something tipsy or stupid yet. But the night was young, and the path to the gardens beckoned, and the possibilities for stupidities glimmered like the candles that lined the way. They wandered through a double row of lilacs, heavy with bloom. On their right stood the greenhouse, its warm glow dappled by the riot of mauve blossoms. The breeze made the blossoms quiver and the butterfly tremble. The light shimmered across the path. In the mingling shadows, Granger held up her hand so that it was silhouetted against the light of the greenhouse. It was steady. It was her left hand that she held up. Her arm was bare against the skin of her inner arm that lay blur. Granger turned, intending to continue down the path. But Draco interrupted by committing the first of the evening's stupidities. Later he would blame the wine. He took her wrist, gently, but she was nonetheless flinched, and pulled it towards him. Granger was shocked. What are you? I didn't realize you still had this, said Draco. He turned her wrist so that the blur of the glamour caught the vacillating light. Well, I do. Her voice was uncertain. She stared at him with wide-eyed wariness, a wild thing about to pull away and run. She smelled like the sweetness of the Saturnus. Two heavy words that Draco had been carrying since Provence came out with difficulty. I'm sorry. It was your mad aunt, not you. I did nothing to stop her. To this, Granger gave no answer. I suppose that if there was a way to heal it, you would have found it, said Draco. I would have. I've tried a great many things, but some things don't heal. No, they don't, said Granger, quiet for a moment. Then she waved the glamour away to reveal the word. Ugly thing. The old injury stood clear on her skin, as raw as the day it had been carved. It glistened still. Draco's mouth was cottony and dry. For a moment she was 17, lying as though dead on the draw-room floor, mere meters from where they stood. Then she was Granger again, a burning intelligence, a world-changer, but still, for all that, marked. Draco's hold on her wrist grew a little tighter, shame and sorrow. Does it still hurt? Asked Draco, because it looked really raw not to. Sometimes. I'm used to it now. Or I just forget. Draco had never had any intention to show her his inner arm, shame. All the more shameful because it was willingly acquired. And yet, he found himself unbuttoning his cuffs and rolling up his sleeve. What was left on his arm was distorted, half-faded mark. It was a grotesque mix of black flesh and raised scar tissue, now from a failed attempt to remove it. Oh, gasped Granger. Mine's uglier. In every way, Granger. I wanted it. The gasp that had been shock more than horror. She was observing the twisted flesh with a healer's eye, one that had seen worse things. Granger was silent for a long time. At length she said, But you don't want it any more. No. That's what matters. It doesn't erase the past, said Draco. The defiled arm he held between them was an eloquent attestation of that. No, but the choices you've made since then define you more than those you made then. Do they? You were 16 years old. We were all child soldiers flung into a war, trying to do what we were taught was right, trying to protect our loved ones. Must you be so terribly forgiving? It's been 15 years, said Granger. She lowered her own arm. She looked weary. I can assure you that I have ruminated on the matter at length. I've forgiven those who deserve it. It rather interferes with my wallowing in self-reproach. Wallowing isn't productive. Now it was Granger's turn to take his wrist. She pulled it to the triangle of light amongst the shadows and leaned in to observe the mark more closely. Draco wanted to pull away, but she had been brave enough to let him look at hers, so he mustn't be a coward now. Her fingers brushed over the scarred ridges and half-melted flesh that had never felt the touch of another's hands. She looked heartsick. You tried to curse it off? Yes, said Draco, amongst other things. Years ago now. His arm twitched under her scrutiny. He wanted to put the mark away again. It was so ugly, so misshapen, so full of hideous memories and shame. I don't think there's much I could do with this one either, said Granger. In terms of healing, I mean. The thought seemed to make her sad. Mine is a memento of some terrible decisions. It's well deserved. Yours is a wretched tragedy. It is, said Granger. Then she added, well, they're both tragedies in different ways. More righteous forgiveness made Draco want to flee. They stood in silence, and now she knew some of his griefs and he knew some of hers. There was an intimacy about it, to being seen. It was unfamiliar, tender to the touch, unnerving. They stood in silence, and yet it wasn't silence. It was thick and dense and whirring. It weighed upon their eardrums and chests like a pressure. I should like a pithy conclusion, or words of wisdom, said Draco to cut through it. Yes, please, said Granger. She seemed relieved. I meant from you. Granger clasped her hands before her and looked up to the stars as though she might find the pithiness there. The enervated cadaver of a man who gave us these scars is quite dead, and we are alive. I think that's good enough. Draco rolled his sleeve back down and did his cufflinks. Granger glamoured her scar back to a discreet blur. It's too beautiful an evening to be maudlin, said Draco. I do not sound that swotty, said Granger. You do. Shall we have a look at the roses? Have your feminine ecstasies at the ready? They wandered down the path and curved through the candlelight until they reached the rose garden. At their feet, midnight violets peeped, here and there, lured out by the crescent moon. Their footsteps were slow and drunk and deliciously aimless. It was perfect. Draco knew too little of the roses to give a real tour, and Granger was content to meander from one to the next, without plan or purpose, touching at their loosely cupped petals. Pretty names fell from her lips as she recognized a few. Annabelle, the Wildfire, the Apolline, the Duchess, Ivory Kiss, Claire, Crimson Romance. Fairy lights twinkled amongst the rose bushes. Petals drifted onto the path. A nightingale sang and fountains gurgled. Granger, with a kind of dreamy-eyed tipsiness, said it was like being in an enchanted glade. Draco wanted to have a go at her for being sentimental, but he found himself also in a soft, mellow kind of mood. The kind of mood in which he might tell a witch that, yes, the roses were sweet, but she was the sweetest thing in the garden, just to see her blush. He did not, because he was made of stronger stuff. Fragrances, delicate and elusive, teased at their noses. Granger tried to name the scents and held up the roses to Draco, so that he could try, and he stood next to her, closer than necessary, and they made idle guesses together. Apple, vanilla, clove, myrrh, honey, amongst the damask. His wine-drenched mind collected impressions, delectable nearness, being close enough to feel her giving off warmth. The rose she held to his face, so close that his lips brushed the petals. The moonlight on her skin, the escaped curls of her hair on her nape, the corner of her mouth, the biting of her lip, eyelashes against the cheek. They moved to the next rose. This one, Granger was convinced, smelled of apricots. Draco came to stand behind her and leaned over her shoulder. To him, it was tangerine. Granger smelled it again and said, "No, apricots, most certainly." And Draco leaned in closer and said, "No, tangerine. Don't be silly." Granger theorized that they might have found an Amortentia rose. That would explain the discrepancy. Draco said he would be sure to record this discovery. They moved on to the next one, a splendid white rose. Granger cupped its heavy head and drew it near. Draco came behind her again, and they both smelled, this time at the same time, and her cheek brushed the chin. He caught himself, just in time, as he was about to put a hand on her waist. That way lay madness. The curve of her skirts brushed against the front of his trousers. Her hair tickled at the side of his face. Granger said it was coconut, and dared him to disagree. Draco disagreed as a matter of course. It was kiwi. Kiwi, repeated Granger. Kiwi, said Draco. Granger said that she would have him sent to an otolaryngologist if he didn't stop this nonsense. Draco said the only nonsense here was the word otolaryngologist. The sweet paralysis was coming over him again, of not wanting to move, of lightness in his veins, of limbs feeling weightless and eyelids feeling heavy. He wanted to put his chin where her neck met her shoulder, and just stand there. He wanted to say things in her ear and feel her shiver against him. He wanted to linger here, being stupid about kiwi, for an age or two. He wanted to float. It was the wine, certainly, and the artichokes. They moved to the next roses, small wild things that grew in bunches and smelled like vetiver. Granger asked if she might pick one. Draco did so for her. It seemed ungentlemanly not to, and he gave it to her, his arm wrapped around her from behind, and their fingertips touched, and it was as close as they could get, touching fingertips over a rose. She looked over her shoulder at him to say thank you, and their eyes met, and hers were dark and curious, and his were light and keen, and it was universes colliding. It was all of those contrapositions of light and dark, and muggle-born and pure-blood, and order and Death-Eater, and terrible incompatibility after terrible incompatibility, the violent polarities that made them who they were. They fell into each other a bit, in that moment of collision, a bit drunk, a bit soul-entangled. She slid the rose into her hair, and turned away. They came to the end of the rose garden, where the hedges grew thickest, and the stupidities might be said more freely, where terrible incompatibilities stopped meaning so much, because here amongst the green boughs and the rustling breeze they were just a man and a woman, meandering through a garden, being idiots about roses. They found a seat on a stone bench near a fountain, adorned with chubby cupids. Granger curled her legs under herself. The rose in her hair was askew, so Draco reached over to fix it, expecting to do so suavely, but finding instead that he was transfixed by a feeling of exquisite nervousness, the likes of which he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. Granger breathed out a thank you. Her cheeks were pink. They talked about things trivial and not, of roses and cupboards and scars and war and artichokes, and of fish pie. They looked up at the smoldering stars, and the night birds warbled their unearthly cadences, and roses dropped their petals in beautiful melancholy. An hour drifted by, and then 2, and then 3, though it felt like they'd only just sat down, beside each other on this damp bench amongst the roses, to wither away the evening. The memory of that night would remain with Draco for a long time afterwards, moon-kissed and sweet, the light in her eyes, the taste of wine, the glitter of starshine in the fountain, the slow seduction of roses,